you would spend any of your very valuable time hanging out here and learning more about some of SBP's advocacy work. And I want to kind of frame up the discussion a little bit with a few slides at the beginning. I see the names I see on this call are people who are deeply familiar with our work, but I just want to remind folks a little of the kind of historical relevance of SBP's expansion and why we're doing things like advising governments and advocating for broader federal and state and local reforms that will empower recovery. It's really all born out of SBP's experience with clients, the lived experience of disaster survivors in communities all around the country. And it's really all sits atop our theory of change, which believes that every disaster survivor has a breaking point and that it's determined by the variables of how long it takes them to recover, how predictable that pathway to recovery is, and then the resilience of each survivor, which can mean horizontal resilience, like you have social networks that can, sustain you in down times, but after disasters, entire communities are affected. And so really what we have in mind here is vertical resilience, which has to do with people being able to access recovery programs and resources that are made available after disasters. And that will occupy a lot of what I talk about today. I do think that I should be able to keep it to about, excuse me, I'm fighting off a cold here, but I do think I should be able to keep it to about 20 or 25 minutes. Hannah will try her best to keep me honest, and I'll leave a lot of time both for questions, but also for folks to have an actual mental break and eat your sandwich. So as you know, on the basis of that theory of change and seeing what we saw in New Orleans all around the country, SBP many years ago stopped counting success as how many homes can we rebuild each year. And we started thinking about what activities could we be engaged in that would obviate the need for our rebuilding services. For every one homeowner we're able to rebuild for, there are 100 we never met who suffered a similar plight. What is it we could do to reduce the total amount of people who even need the kind of assistance that SBP offers through our build intervention? As you know, we do 5 interventions now. We build, we share our resources with other organizations. We try and prepare communities in advance. We advise state and local government leaders that are doing recovery and resilience policymaking and implementing programs. And then, of course, we advocate for the reform of disaster recovery strategies, and that would improve the predictability and speed of recovery resources in the country. And I see Mike Sullivan made it in, calling him out for the video. Mike, great to see you and your energy. Appreciate that. Whoop, whoop. This has been SBP's advocacy agenda for 2022, and it's going to remain so for 2023. It's possible we are going to experiment with some state and local advocacy efforts in some of our communities where SBP is placing fellows, but for the most part, we want to remain tightly focused on these 3 initiatives. And I'll tell you that each of these relates back to the experience of an SBP survivor. When we look at the individuals that we've served in Louisiana, in Missouri, in New York, in New Jersey, in Texas, in South Carolina, and all these other places, it's impossible to think that the experience of our survivors is a sort of one-off thing that's just happening to a few people. It's impossible, in fact, not to see that there's actually a systematic issue that is producing the experience that our clients are experiencing all over the country. And so advocacy is really about taking the lived experience of our clients and trying to resolve policy and regulatory hurdles that are causing the system to function and create our clients in the first place. So we'll run through 3 central issues here, kind of in chronology after the disaster. So boom, the disaster happens, the president declares it a major disaster. Now people are able to apply for FEMA and other types of assistance. The issue is that application's really complicated. You have to provide a ton of financial background and home ownership information. And you end up applying for FEMA assistance. You're referred to the Small Business Administration. If you apply for a loan, which you have to in order to receive other types of FEMA assistance, you may be approved or denied. If you're denied, you'll be referred back to FEMA. And this is not to mention the applications you'll fill out for assistance from organizations like the American Red Cross or Team Rubicon or SPP. And each time they fill out that application, about 80% of the information is exactly the same as the application that came before. And over half of it is available via an individual's IRS tax returns that are filed volitionally each year. So what SPP's been after and advocating for a few years now is a sort of conceptual one app, a layer of data collection and abstraction that allows the information to be collected from a disaster survivor applicant one time and held in such a way that individual responding federal and state and local agencies can reach into that database and pull the information out that they need to verify individual applicants for their services or for their resources. Having a simple a single application for disaster assistance has been unappealing to the existing federal agencies. We talked a little with folks at FEMA and HUD. No one at SBA, but both FEMA and HUD expressed grave concerns that their agency wouldn't be willing to collect information that wasn't needed to verify an applicant's eligibility for assistance provided only by that agency. Furthermore, they wouldn't be interested in holding it or securing the PII that would be collected. And so we think that without congressional intervention, no agency is going to take a leadership role here in creating a single application. And so we think legislation is possible. Most recently, there was a Senate bill 4599, the Disaster Assistance Simplification Act. I won't read this slide to you, but it essentially creates one app. We're really excited to see it introduced. I don't think that it's going to pass in the lame duck session, but we're going to push for its reintroduction in the 118th Congress. And Hannah and I were just listing yesterday a bunch of other NGOs and industry associations and partner organizations we think we can rally in support of that legislation to generate enough broad and deep bipartisan support to get it out of committee and onto the floor and voted into actual law. If we're able to make the application for assistance simpler, more people are likely to get what they need from FEMA, and so fewer people would need SBP to rebuild, and that's why it remains our one of our primary efforts. The second, once you've applied for FEMA, now they're going to come out and assess your damage. And I'll rant on this one because we've got the time, but you wouldn't believe it because I read in the news a couple of weeks ago that NASA crashed a spaceship into a meteor and changed its trajectory, which is freaking crazy. But FEMA, in order to inspect damage to homes after disasters, deploys part-time inspectors from communities not affected by the disaster to travel around the surface of the disaster impacted earth and verify the damage to individual houses with their eyeballs, one house at a time. So we need to hook NASA and FEMA up because there's clearly a disparity in the technology that's being used here. We know that the real problem with this is that people are getting less assistance than they need from FEMA. The real problem with that is that 96% of the millions of people who apply for FEMA assistance each year accept whatever FEMA gives them on the first award. So FEMA's commitment to this slow, biased, errored, often incorrect and inaccurate inspection process is generating a scenario where millions of Americans are receiving thousands of dollars and less in assistance than what they're actually eligible for and what they're actually due. You see here that more than 60% of the people that are applying for FEMA appeals with SBP's help are successful. And it's not chump change. It's about $7,700 per applicant. So we're after FEMA to adopt insurance industry technology that will allow them to use aerial imagery and flyover and predictive analytics and remote estimation technology to get estimates right the first time, so that we don't have to worry about the fact that 96% of people accept the first award, because we feel much more confident that the first award is an accurate representation of an individual's loss. This is an example of what we're talking about, just to give it a little color. After Hurricane Michael in 2018, FEMA made a big mistake. I request data from them after every single disaster, and they never give it to me. But somebody, maybe an intern, made an error after Hurricane Michael, and they sent me a few thousand rows of properties in Florida, personally identifiable information. We could see what they got from FEMA, and then we went and looked at third-party aerial imagery so that we could place FEMA verified loss amounts on top of aerial imagery and show what people were actually getting from FEMA. And what we found was pretty shocking. You can see the pictures here. The one on the left got less than $6,000. The one on the right got $36,000. And we found that occurring all over the place at about a rate of 20%. We went to FEMA and presented them with the information, and no action was taken. We presented it to some local officials in Bay County, and they insisted that FEMA inspectors go out and look at 7 properties in that county. And 6 of those properties received additional assistance. One of them went from a $1,000 award to a $37,000 max grant. Imagine that happening at scale. So SPP has been after a partnership with FEMA, right? Once we saw that after Hurricane Michael, we said, wow, we've got to do something about this. I mentioned earlier, we request data every single disaster, the same set and amount of data so that we can perform that same wide area analysis. And FEMA has never given it to us ever again. We requested as SPP, I've requested it as a city in Southwest Louisiana. I've requested it as the state of Louisiana. And then I conferred with the FEMA Region 4 director and Dr. Melissa Forbes, who leads the response and recovery directorate at FEMA. And they let me know pretty clearly that FEMA's not in a place where it can or is willing to share the information that I'm asking for. FEMA's sort of stranglehold around personally identifiable data and the lawyers and insurance underwriters' reticence to share that has created a market where we're not going to be able to perform this wide area analysis because FEMA's not going to let itself share the information with us. That's driven SPP to do a couple of things. First, we're going to have to pursue it with Dr. Forbes's boss, Administrator Criswell, in the next Congress. And we think that FEMA leaders will ask for a congressional roundtable so that they can express to Congress the limitations, the legal limitations they feel they have in the ability to share that. But all this is to create a market where SPP can do more of this appeals work. Right now, short of being able to access wide aggregate data in the communities where we're requesting it, we're left to do the amazing work that Claire and her team are doing in a few different communities right now. And that's going around and meeting individual disaster survivors and understanding one survivor at a time. What did you receive from FEMA? How was your property inspected? Did it consider all the appropriate things that were done to your home and that, property that you lost? And if not, let's see if we can appeal that. I mentioned this here, not to take any credit for it, but really to draw a lot of attention to the successful work of Claire and her team. The reason we're after these pilot programs and the reason this is a priority advocacy effort for SPP is that if we fix the FEMA evaluation process, again, people will get thousands more in assistance days or weeks after the disaster. They're much less likely to need the assistance of a nonprofit organization 7 or 10 years after the disaster. So that's why we hold it up, and that's why it's such a crucial advocacy objective here at SPP. We are continuing to pursue pathways that will allow us to do the data evaluation in aggregate. Hannah and I are headed to Tallahassee in a couple of weeks, hopefully to discuss this with folks in Florida's Department of Emergency Management. How can we work discreetly with that agency who's in possession of the FEMA data we're discussing in order to perform this analysis and make recommendations where FEMA should reinspect properties. The last one, and then I'm going to be quiet because I think we're coming to my time. The last one is how long it takes long-term recovery assistance to get there. It's not a joke. It takes a literal act of Congress. There's legislation out there now that would authorize the CDBG-DR program in a statutory way, and that would cure the act of Congress part. But for right now, after a disaster, FEMA assistance flows when the president declares, but for any supplemental assistance to be assigned to the community, it first has to be appropriated in Congress. And so congressional leaders get together and they sort of horse trade over who's going to get how much and how much should go into the bill and what congressional vehicle it should actually get attached to. And this ends up taking quite a while. After Congress decides what to do, HUD finds out how much money it's going to receive. And then HUD has to take a while applying its formula to determine how much each affected state in the period in question is going to receive based on the appropriation received from Congress. Then that takes HUD a while. Then HUD publishes some rules on how the state and local governments are going to be able to use it. Then the state and local governments have to write plans that they send off to HUD. And then HUD takes its really sweet time looking at those plans, and there's some back and forth. And then finally the plans get approved. And then the state and local governments hire contractors. You see how long this takes. Ultimately, it's like 3 years from the time a disaster happens to the time homes are being rebuilt in a community. In Louisiana right now, the very first Hurricane Laura homes are not going to get rebuilt before the end of this year. The state of Louisiana's program will not reach scale before the summer of next year. And that'll be nearly 3 full years after Hurricane Laura and Hurricane Delta affected the southwest part of the state. This is the delay we're trying to overcome, because the crazy thing about that is right now, today in Florida, we can use socioeconomic data and ownership data to go in and identify people who own their home. They don't own other homes. They have an unfavorable relationship to area median income, and they're highly likely to receive CDBG-DR assistance when Florida gets it a few years from now, right? But SBP can go in there and identify the people who are most likely to be eligible for it today. And with that ability, we can go out and make loans to them, as we're doing in Louisiana right now. We call it the Recovery Acceleration Fund, but it's essentially a collection of social impact, environmental, social governance, philanthropic, and just traditional investment, seeking a return of about 4 to 6%, but it's pooled together. Loans are made to low-income applicants whose homes need to be repaired today, right? People for whom the most affordable way to get them home is to return them to the affordable home they already own. By making the repairs today, we'll make them much, much more affordable, because the homes won't sit in dilapidation for the next 2 to 3 years. By making the repairs ourselves, the state of Florida will then have to mount a much smaller construction program, or they'll have to deal with much less administrative hassle of overseeing however many homes we're able to rebuild. And then once they do actually receive their money, SBP can submit sort of the invoices and all of the client applicant files to the state of Florida, and they'll use the HUD money to reimburse all of those loans. We've successfully set up this framework in Louisiana, thanks to the hard work of Keith McCulloch and Steve Doolin and Grace and Stella and a whole bunch of other people who are really making the rubber meet the road in Louisiana. But we're optimistic that there'll be a chance to implement recovery acceleration funds in Kentucky and Florida as well, if I'm successful getting those governors and their administrators to include the conditions we need for recovery acceleration fund. The image that you see on the screen here is really how we want RAF to work versus how it works now. In many communities, reimbursement is a condition that's included in the long-term recovery action plan. When it's included, states are allowed to reimburse eligible survivors for qualified expenses. The problem is that the way it's been used over the years is that it really only works for people who can reach into their own bank account and self-finance repairs, right? People who have to take on loans in order to do this don't really qualify, because they aren't going to be able to get the loan. And so it favors those who already have means. For those who don't have means, it kind of works like the center row you see here. They apply for FEMA, they get whatever assistance they receive, then they just have to wait for a long time, 2, 3 years. So the state of Louisiana or Kentucky or Florida, whomever receives their money and starts up and makes repairs. Now, during that 2 to 8 year period, the families living on different people's couches, in and out of temporary shelter situation. Kids are changing schools lots of the time. It's a very tumultuous and unpredictable time. If states include the conditions we're talking about, which is where you're allowed to use the reimbursement pathway to reimburse eligible repair debt taken on by individual disaster survivors, then it can work like the bottom row for everyone. Low to moderate income families who most desperately need to get back into their homes, but also middle income families who can finance repairs. And in both cases, it's lowering the administrative burden for government and reducing the total cost of repairs by making them much earlier in the process. So you see there on the bottom row, the family gets to move home as soon as the repair is made. And it doesn't matter that they couldn't self-finance it, because the Recovery Acceleration Fund could. And so in that way, low income families, Black and brown communities, those most severely affected and who often have to wait the longest on the paltriest amounts of federal assistance would instead be, the pyramid would be inverted. And the low income and most needy folks would be moved to the top of the priority chain, served not by government and taxpayer dollars, but by private capital that's seemingly most interested in serving the people who need help the most. It's a really elegant model. And I'm confident that if we can get the conditions together in Florida, this will see soaring success in 2023. And that if we're able to really nail it down right, SBP will be far from the largest operator in this marketplace. Money managers and banks and other big finance firms will start to figure out ways to do this at scale if we can prove that there's actually a win-win-win scenario here. Survivors move home sooner, governments benefit, taxpayers benefit. We're really excited about it. As I mentioned, it's underway in Louisiana now. 6 projects are being built. 4 of those 6 are going to be done by the end of the year, and we suspect we'll rebuild another 20 or 25 next year. We do need to get some other conditions in other states' action plans. JR, Joe, Hannah, a whole bunch of other people not on this phone call are aggressively helping me do that in Kentucky and soon in Florida. And so I appreciate that. And we're going to keep on fundraising. I know that Keith and I share the goal of creating an instrument here that can accept funding in a kind of evergreen way, or 12 months out of the year, not just in times of disaster, so that we're able to have a large ready reserve of lendable cash that we can use to lend as soon as the conditions are arrived at in states, but really use the promise of that pool of capital to get the conditions we need in places like Kentucky and Florida. So we're going to continue to invest in RAF. I'm thrilled about the progress that we're making in Louisiana, but I think that one really is our very biggest bet. And so the advocacy here is not so much at the federal level, except in, support and encouragement for states to do this, but really in landing the appropriate market conditions with governors in the disaster impacted states where we hope to operate RAF. With that, I'm going to stop and take a break, and or not take a break. I'm going to take a pause and see what questions folks have. And I only have one rule. If you have questions, show your faces. That'd be great for the YouTube.
I'm definitely going to highlight that part. Thank you. No questions?
Reese, one question I have is, here we're talking about all the events that get federal disaster declarations, where obviously we're seeing the greatest need for help in communities, but knowing that we're seeing an increasing number of events that might have really severe localized impacts, but may or may not receive those declarations. And then there's endless talk about if thresholds will go up in future. What is your thought on how SBP interacts with those types of communities and situations, and again, demonstrating how to reduce delays, et cetera, when federal funds may not be accessible to the same extent?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question, Helen. I think it really has to do with growing our networks and making impact in the places where those funds are available, right? What we know now is that there's a marketplace that leads people astray, particularly government leaders that are getting those resources. And so I'm most focused on preventing what I think is a kind of pirate seas from occurring. But in communities that aren't, first off, we should probably consider lowering the threshold. Each time they go back and review that, what it takes to get a specific county declared or what the verified loss amount is, when it goes up, it's apparently good for taxpayers because it's essentially raising the deductible, right, for the federal government to get involved. At the same time, it almost always goes to the detriment of small to medium-sized communities who are unlikely one at a time to have that sort of combined impact or ever meet that threshold. So I'm always wary whenever I see consideration of moving that number around. And what I'd suspect we'd have to say to those not meeting the threshold is, show us how you're tabulating it now. Perhaps there's a more clever way we could think of helping you tabulate it that does get to that amount, or that would help get you closer, more predictably closer. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's some thoughts.
That's helpful perspective on what would make sense from an SBP angle.
thanks for your question. You guys know I taught philosophy 101, right? I could just sit here all day. Doesn't bother me at all.
I don't have a question, but it kind of is. So could we replace LMI with individuals with an unfavorable relationship with area median income? Because I think that might be my favorite way that I've ever heard it referred to as.
There are some, no, we cannot change it to that. It's like it's the opposite of plain language. There are some though who, when it's said like that, they understand that's what they need to understand it. Thanks, Joe. All right, well, I mean, I can call on people. I'm just kidding. I'm not going to call on people. I'll wait a couple more minutes if folks have questions or, yeah, I don't know if there's anything you'd like me to comment on. It may be dangerous.
I'm not sure if this is a question. To me, all this seems like a slam dunk. Like 3 years is interminably long for anyone to wait. Like, of course, we should be shrinking that time. I'm curious, I guess, what pushback are you getting from governments about, making those shifts so that, what is like the negative, the reasons why they would not do it, I guess.
Yeah, great question. So one out to simplify means to create a new thing. To create a new thing means to spend an unknown amount of federal money and hire new people and do lots of research. And so those who wish to keep federal spending in line often jump on that right away and say, are you kidding me? We're spending money, not being successful. And the thing we want to do to correct it is spend more money to make it simpler. No way, like no more spending on it, no more spending on it. That's some of the pushback that you hear. It's a little short-sighted. It's kind of silly. On the FEMA damage assessment stuff, this is hard to believe. I have a diagram that shows how I believe FEMA operates. It's just 4 like circles in a Venn diagram. There's what the federal law and regulation says, which is most likely what they're going to do because they're a federal agency. There's what the leadership is prioritizing at any given moment. There's what state and local governments are asking and demanding from FEMA. And then there's what the media and advocates like us are pushing on FEMA to go and do. On the damage assessment stuff, FEMA has access to all the technology we're describing. It really has more to do with its standard operating procedures. FEMA doesn't think, it doesn't feel, and I don't mean that in a nasty way. It's a computer. It just runs programs. It's got people who sit in different seats all the time. The way they live their life is by finding the appropriate rule and then following it. And the way the rules say at FEMA is when a presidential declaration is declared and individual assistance is authorized, FEMA will deploy inspectors via the contracts and the blah, blah, blah. So that's what they do. They have access to this technology, but they are not currently allowing themselves to accept imagery or data gleaned from the use of technology. They won't allow that to be the standard they accept. Their standard says they accept visual proof typed into the da-da-da-da-da with a consumer price index and the whatever. And so what we need there is some group of people championing it inside FEMA to make the regulation say that. But then on a more like kind of whisper network thing that you hear is that there was some instance a few years ago in Missouri. And in that case, the state was paid many tens of scores of millions of dollars for debris removal on the basis only of aerial imagery. FEMA was trying something out. We're going to pay it lickety split, go as fast as we can. Look at the pictures, all good. They later tried to tie it back to disaster damage and like do the appropriate check on it, and they couldn't. The tech didn't hold up to it. There was no human verification. In the end, they had to claw a bunch of money back from the state of Missouri. And there is a senior group of people at FEMA who remember this very public burn. and failure. And so some of them say, yes, let's use the technology. We love it. And then they turn right around to their colleagues and they're like, but don't let that technology screw us like it did back. We got to make sure that we're verifying that at every step. And so that is hard to fight against because you don't know who's on which side of it really. So I don't care so much about that as looking for opportunities really to pilot it. And I think those are the two forces that we're up against. Lawyers who worry if you share personally identifiable data, the only thing a group like SBP could do is turn it into a tool that they use against you to evaluate your performance and show what a bad job you're doing, or accidentally leak that information to the public, therefore exposing a bunch of personal, you know what I mean? So they see absolutely no upside in sharing the kind of data or forming that kind of partnership. They feel like, well, this could only do us harm. So why would we do that? If I were FEMA's lawyers, I may view that the same way, but that could be a presentation problem with me and one hopefully we'll overcome. For the Recovery Acceleration Fund, there's not a ton of pushback, honestly. In the last consolidated appropriations report bill or report language, SBP was named and HUD was encouraged to experiment with things like RAF. Late last fall, we got the state of Louisiana to write HUD a letter saying, hey, we want to do RAF in Louisiana. Do you think that would be okay? And HUD wrote back and said, we'd love it. We've always loved it. We'd love it if you do that. The hesitation you find is at the state government level, where someone says, wait. You're going to lend private money now, and I'm going to pay you back with money I don't even know I have yet. Will HUD like that? Is the OIG, am I going to get in trouble later? And so the trick is, how can we show them, look, Congress said it's okay. Look, HUD said it's okay. Look, the governor of Louisiana wrote me a letter to go raise money. Hey, Governor Beshear, maybe you want to write a letter too. But I'm such a simple thinker, Andrea, that's how my thinking around it works. But that's sort of the only hesitation is basic human stuff. Individuals who are risk averse, they don't want to experience pain from new things. New stuff is inherently risky. Old stuff, it's what we know, it's what we do. So that kind of thing. Is that helpful or useful at all?
Very, thank you.
Sure.
Kind of a weird question, but I'm interested how climate resilience kind of can tie into some of this stuff. And I guess from the perspective of that being such a touchy subject, is that also why disaster resilience in itself is kind of a tough topic for some folks?
Yeah, I don't know. There are some people for whom it's a touchy subject. I think for most people, it's just whether you capitalize the C or whether you want to talk about the effects of weather patterns but communities that have been affected by downpours that are more severe than they experienced 20 years ago, they don't care. You know what I mean? The quibble about, I guess when I think about climate resilience, Mike, I think that right now, thanks to the work, 7 to 10 years ago and some of the intervening years of folks like the Clinton Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation and others, they drove a conversation, a really meta conversation about resilience, climate, what it means to be resilient, how to live with water, how to think about that. And the practical effect of providing 100 resilience officers in 100 resilient cities all around the globe is it's hard to measure, really. They spent a lot of money on it. Some cool stuff got developed, some stuff didn't. But ultimately what did happen, Mike, was it got a group of more engaged leaders thinking about that, like the US Congress. And more recently, it's gotten those people appropriating money to stuff like this, like the president and the executive branch and, the most recent budget. So we see the creation of things like building resilient infrastructure in communities, the FEMA BRIC program. And we see the further capitalization of stuff like the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program and the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program, which are meant to buy communities out, improve the conditions in communities so that they aren't affected so badly by rising water. And so to me, there was something really cool happened like 15 years ago or so started happening that everybody for a while was like, that was a little hazy. Did anything come from that? But what came from it is these initial investments from FEMA and BRIC and FMA and HMA, that's going to grow enormously. I suspect there'll be 5 to 10 billion put into it sometime in the next 2 to 5 years. And that number is only going to grow as states and communities are able to show that they're effectively using that resilience money to protect communities from the worst that disaster ends up bringing. So the more successful projects there are like that, where they can say, look, we got 7 inches more rain last year than we did 10 years ago, but we had fewer properties damaged than ever before because we were able to install pumps or whatever. Those kinds of success stories, I think, will get additional funding. And that will be cool because those of you who follow it know that there are lots of great studies out there, somewhere between $4, $7, and $11 spent on recovery. If you spend $1 on resilience, you get $11 worth of recovery, if that makes sense. So it's awesome to see FEMA putting billions of dollars into preparedness and resilience. The onus really is now on state and local governments to prove how they're using that to protect against weather patterns, climate impact, capital climate change, however that community needs to refer to it, the new and different and more severe weather events that it's experiencing. So I think that's been a kind of cool thing that's happening, and I'm still learning about it as well. Thanks for that question, Mike. All right, we're going to set a 15-second timer here, and April is going to ask a question. I can feel it. I saw such a focused brow there.
All right. I wasn't going to, but I'm going to. So, because this is probably just my favorite thing to do, Reese, what are the important relationships for you to develop in the field and in different states that kind of help you and help our mission move forward?
Excellent question. Thank you. In state and local governments, it's mayors and county executives. So executive branch decision makers in units of local and jurisdictional government are almost always the most interesting folks to talk to, because they're where the programs get executed and usually where they get, or not always where they get funded, but almost always where they get executed. So those folks are interesting. State, county offices of emergency management, because they're implicated right after disasters. Obviously, governor's offices, but then also state agencies that oversee housing or long-term recovery dollars. In Texas, it's the GLO. In Louisiana, the General Land Office. In Louisiana, it's the Office of Community Development. Those agencies matter. On the Hill, it's really congressional committees of jurisdiction, like oversight and appropriation. Transportation and infrastructure matters. The Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee in the Senate is quite important for us. The Homeland Security Committee in the House, and a couple of others, where there are decision makers and committees that pass legislation that has to do with FEMA and with HUD and the kinds of stuff they're doing. And then always FEMA and HUD, because they're the two biggest and most significantly implicated federal agencies after every disaster. So that's kind of the world as I see it when I'm moving in and out of communities. And to the extent that you all meet or know folks like that in your community, let me know. We can figure out what to talk to them about together.
Cool.
Great question, April. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, now we're going to set the 15-second timer. And Kyle, you call it at 15 seconds. I'm so thankful again that y'all would spend any time at all on this bright Tuesday. It's Thursday, right? Okay. All right, I appreciate y'all. Everybody go forth, do great things.
Reese, thank you so much. Y'all have a great day. Take care.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks so much.